How's it going, everybody? It's the beginning of a new week. As I told you earlier, that I don't think I will be doing Devo. I will be doing Devos today, tomorrow, and Wednesday, but not. But after Wednesday, which is the first in-person youth group we will have had in like 9 or 10 weeks, I will switch over to maybe doing a devotional once or twice a week. So the end of these things are coming pretty darn close, which is pretty fantastic for me. And seeing that there's only one person here right now live, and the viewership has gone down on recent videos, I would assume that that's also kind of good for you guys as well. Anyways, wrapping up though, this is the beginning of a new week. That's what it says down here, the title, beginning of a new week. And it's kind of like taking those steps back to normalcy, back to kind of what we understand as normal anyways. And that's this week. Obviously, the graduates, we're supposed to have graduation this Sunday. I didn't really talk about it last week. I didn't really want to, I don't know. Graduation is happening. Hopefully for HLV people in August, Iowa Valley people in the month of June, I think. And it looked like about 10 students at the Lutheran Church yesterday were able to celebrate to some extent their graduation day. So that was fantastic for those 10 students. And anyways, getting back to normal, you have to take these small steps back because we've taken such a drastic step away from the normal or the norm that we understood before COVID, that any steps towards the norm, getting back to life, is always big, always nice. And so youth group happening on Wednesday from 6 to 8 is exactly what we would be normally doing. It's just that it wouldn't have been a month off or 2 months off or however long it's been. And so that's a little bit for your parents out there. If they want to watch this video or not, we are taking some precautions. I mean, obviously having youth group is a risk that you have to kind of deal with and say, is the trade-off worth it, and that kind of stuff. And as a parent, I respect that decision. It's a tough call. At least for some, it's a tough call. And so we're going to be outside. That's a big one. Okay, not circulated air, but being outside, fresh air, all that stuff. That's a huge step. Number 2, we are going to have the ability to have the students wash their hands. So students, when you come, you'll probably wash your hands before, and then, during, I guess, throughout the evening or whatever that we're at youth group. Not all the time, not constantly, but just, it'll be available. We're also going to do as much as we can social distancing type of games, even though we're outside, not trying to play games where you're constantly, in a group or solid group of people or whatever. So anyways, we're trying to do what we can, but at the same time, knowing that youth group in general is not 100% risk-free. But life really isn't 100% risk-free. Life, there's always some risk. So with that being said, let's get to our Devo time. I don't think I have anything more to say. My weekend was great, though. We had a few more people at church on Sunday. I was able to hang out at Brian and Tiffany's house. It was a good time, at least for me. It was a blessing for me. Their kids are a blessing, and it's always good to be around their whole family. I see Brian here and there. We go golfing and stuff, and he's obviously the man, but his whole family's great. And I've known Tiff longer than I've known Brian. So now I'm rambling. Let's get on to the Devo time. So Jonathan failed to get me a rando devotional. So we're going back to Acts, and we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 9. It's a story of Paul's conversion, the Apostle Paul. Many of you know who the Apostle Peter is and the Apostle Paul. They're big names in church history. This is his conversion, his first steps in faith in Jesus, if you will. So let's take a look at that. Chapter 9, verse 1. If you remember chapter 8, before we stepped away from it, was Philip was evangelizing different people, and lots of people were getting saved from a guy named Philip. But chapter 9 says, meanwhile, while that was happening, Saul was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers. Saul being the person of Paul, but he had 2 names, and he was going by Saul here. So Saul was uttering threats of and was eager to kill, it says, the Lord's followers. So he went to the high priest, and he requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus, asking for their cooperation in the arrest of any followers of the way he found there. He wanted to bring them, both men and women, back to Jerusalem in chains. So let's stop there after verse 2. Paul wants to kill Christians. That's the headline of this article. The Apostle Paul wants to kill Christians. Okay, and that's where he's coming from. He's not a nice guy. Okay, he's not a kind of wishy-washy, let bygones be bygones. You believe your thing, I believe my thing. No. He hates Christians for believing that Jesus is the Messiah, teaching it, and now he is so upset about it that he's killing people. He watched Stephen get killed. In essence, he kind of supervised it. Now he's looking to kill other Christians. That's where Paul is coming from at this moment in his life. We also told here one of the original names for Christians was not Christian. It was the Way, which it's a little new agey, I guess, the Way or whatever. But that was one of the first names for being a follower of Jesus, was the Way. And obviously it could come from when Jesus says that he was the way, the truth, and the life. And so it's a perfectly great name because we follow the way to heaven, Jesus, being Jesus. He does not like that. Paul does not like that at this time, though, and he hates them so much that he wants to kill them. And he wants to not just do the killing in Jerusalem and get rid of that. He wants to kill them in Damascus. If you see that, it says he requested letters be addressed to the synagogues of Damascus, talking about taking out Christians there. Probably because there were Christians there, and we'll see that there were some Christians there. And that's one of the big things that I wanted to just address, was that Christianity was spreading so fast that it was already out of the country of Israel, because Damascus is in Syria, in the north of Israel. So let's keep reading. As he was approaching Damascus on this mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. The voice replied, "I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do." The men with Saul stood speechless, for they heard the sound of someone's voice, but saw no one. Saul picked himself up off the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he was blind. So his companions led him by the hand to Damascus. He remained there blind for 3 days and did not eat or drink. Now there was a believer in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord spoke to him in a vision, calling Ananias. "Yes, Lord," he replied. The Lord said, "Go over to Straight Street, to the house of Judas." Excuse me. "When you get there, ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul. He is praying to me right now. I have shown him a vision of a man named Ananias coming in and laying hands on him so he can see again." "But Lord," exclaimed Ananias, "I've heard many people talk about the terrible things this man has done to the believers in Jerusalem, and he is authorized by the leading priests to arrest everyone who calls upon your name." But the Lord said, "Go, for Saul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings as well as to the people of Israel, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake." So Ananias went and found Saul. He laid his hands on him and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road, has sent me so that you might regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." Instantly, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he got up and was baptized. Afterward, he ate some food and regained his strength. So, a couple things for our devotional time that we're going to get to, and then we'll be done for the day. Number one is that Christianity has been spreading. So months, maybe a year or two that Jesus had ascended. I mean, like the timeline might be a little fishy, but at the same time, it's not like the church has existed for years and years or decades and decades at this point. And yet, there are Christians already in Damascus. The gospel had been spreading like wildfire. Now, the reason why this is kind of interesting to me, or I think is of note, that like, oh, there is a Christian in Damascus named Ananias. Probably not just one. There's a church there, group of believers, and the gospel is spreading. Now imagine this. There's no town in Iowa that you can probably go to and not find a Christian. There's clearly churches in almost every town in Iowa. Maybe some of them are shady churches, and so you might be able to say there's not a great Bible-believing church in every town, but there's certainly Christians in every. If you could literally go Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, Marengo, Brooklyn, Victor, any town in Iowa, you're going to find Christians there, and that's not even a big deal. I mean, it's like, yeah, there's obviously Christians there, but in this point in time, I think it's amazing that there are Christians in Damascus because, again, it's the church is so young, and that either through people just like being in Jerusalem, hearing the gospel from Peter on Pentecost, getting saved, and then going back to Damascus, or the persecution gets so big that people run away. It talked about a couple of chapters before, and they ran to Damascus. I don't know, but it's cool to me because at that point in time, there were a lot of places in the world that you could have gone and there would have been no Christians. But Damascus, there were believers already there. And it wasn't close to Israel or Jerusalem. It was kind of far, especially if you're walking. So Paul is going on his road there to kill them. He wants to murder Christians. Again, murder Christians. When he sees this bright light, he has an interaction with Jesus on the road to Damascus, almost to the city of Damascus, if you read it correctly. And he correctly says, "Who are you, Lord?" And then Jesus says, "I'm the one you are persecuting. I'm Jesus." And it's great that Jesus, I think it's a cool point to be made that Jesus was identifying with the persecuted Christians, that it wasn't they that were getting persecuted, but it was him. That the hatred that Paul had really to want to kill those people, it was really because of Jesus. It wasn't because of them. And obviously, he's making that point, Jesus does, to Paul, and then makes that And at some point over those 3 days, Paul makes a conversion to Jesus, that he believes then in Jesus. Because when Ananias comes to him, it doesn't say that they pray together and he receives Christ. It says he gets baptized. Baptism is not salvation. Baptism, we talked about this with the Ethiopian eunuch. Baptism is a symbol of what happened on the inside. It's a symbolic moment to demonstrate what your faith looks like and how you have changed, right? Going from death to life, in the water, out of the water. But so at some point, Paul made a conversion either at the moment of the light or some point in those 3 days. He made that conscious decision, I'm going to now be a follower of Jesus. And when he did, Ananias comes, heals his blindness, and then he gets baptized, and then obviously the rest is history for the Apostle Paul. We might get into that, depending on if Jonathan gets me his rando Bible verse or not. But besides the whole like Christianity spreading like wildfire at this point, and Saul's conversion, there's one other kind of major thing about this, and that was God asking or telling Ananias that he had to go find Saul and pray for him and kind of welcome into the faith. And Ananias is like, I don't want to do that. And he didn't want to do it because he had heard that this guy was a murderer, that he wanted to kill Christians. And so this early Christian had a very similar attitude that I have and a lot of Christians have, where we don't want to do things that are going to cause us pain. That's a natural human reaction. We don't want to go where it's going to obviously hurt or do things that are obviously going to cause us pain. And yet Ananias was, even though he didn't want to do it, he eventually obeyed God and did it. And so I think Ananias is a great illustration for us about how, as Christians, we live today. We're people. We're for like if we want to bring in the COVID thing here, people are afraid of COVID. Christians are afraid of COVID, and it's a real fear. It's not a made up, make believe fear or whatever. That people are genuinely afraid of COVID, and just like Ananias, like, look, this guy might kill me. Like, why are you sending me here, Lord? And he gets an explanation from God, and then eventually goes. But ultimately, that reaction it's not horrible. Okay, you're not a horrible human being or a horrible Christian if there are things in your life that you're afraid of, or that you are concerned about, and you don't want to do those things. Like, I mean, I'm just being as honest with you as I can. Ananias is a perfect example of a Christian that was told directly by God, do this. And he was like, are you sure about this, God? Like, I don't know. And so when you have doubts, when you have concerns, you're in good company. Like a lot of Christians have that same concern, I guess is what I'm trying to say. However, and this is the ultimate, Ananias obeys. Even though he was afraid, even though he was concerned, even though he was like, this guy might kill me, he still obeys the Lord. And that's sort of where we need to end in any conversation with God. Like, I'm afraid, God, I don't know if I want to do this, that kind of thing. Ultimately, we need to obey God. The struggle can happen, and you can talk to God about whatever it is that you're talking, whatever you're concerned about or afraid about. But ultimately, we need to obey God and do what He wants. And it worked out fine for Ananias. Again, he was this Saul dude legitimately was there to kill him, and yet he was willing to still step out in faith. And then it worked out because obviously Paul becomes the Apostle Paul and does amazing things for the gospel, to further the gospel. And I said that was kind of like the last thing or the other point, but the last point, I guess, before we end things here. You might have noticed that I mentioned several times that Paul was going to murder. He was on a mission to kill people, Christians even. And yet God chose him to be one of his children, to find faith in him, to be a follower of Jesus, and then ultimately, eventually, God chooses him to be used to bring others to Christ. In fact, you could argue that he was the most important, significant Christian in the history of the world. And this was the guy who was trying to murder Christians. God is an amazing God that can transform any heart. And he chooses people just because he chooses them. And you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be amazing beforehand. You just have to place your faith and trust in Jesus. And then he will transform you. That's what being born again means, is being transformed into this new person. And it doesn't matter what you've done in the past. God can forgive you. And if he can forgive Paul or Saul, who wanted and did murder Christians, then he can basically forgive anybody, is, I think, the big point. And Paul will even say this later in his letters, that he is an example to all people. He's the chief of all sinners, and God still forgave him. Therefore, he can forgive you. So I don't know what you've done in your life. If you're younger, maybe you haven't done that many bad things, comparatively speaking, to somebody who's like 70. But ultimately, we're all sinners. There's things that every single human being is ashamed of that they've done. And this is a perfect moment for you and I to remember that God forgives us, because he just does. There was nothing that Paul did up to this point that would have been like, hey, this is why God chose him. No, that didn't exist. God just chose him, offered him forgiveness, and Paul took it. Paul had an interaction with Jesus. He could have said, nope, I'm still trying to kill you or kill your people. But instead he says no, and he chose to follow Jesus. And then it was radically changed. He went from killing Christians to being the Christian that was willing to die. An amazing transformation that not only happened with Paul, but can happen with all of us. So anyways, with that, we're basically out of time here. The story of Paul's conversion is amazing. And again, for the specific purpose that if Paul can be saved, anybody can be saved. If Paul can be forgiven because he was trying to murder people, then you and I can be also forgiven, including murderers. Like, there's people in prison right now for murdering somebody, and they also have the opportunity. If they were to receive the Lord's forgiveness, they would be saved. And, whatever. They're not beyond God's forgiveness or grace, is what I'm trying to say. Anyways, with that, ultimately, I'll see you tomorrow at noon, but I'm looking really forward to Wednesday at 6 o'clock, because that's when we'll be having youth group, and I'll be seeing you again. Maybe we won't be able to give hugs, have to touch elbows or something, but I'm looking way forward to it. Please let people know, get the word out, and yeah, I'm excited to see you guys in just a couple of days. With that, stay classy and have a great one, guys.